We all know there are two types of holiday makers. There is the one who plays it safe. Traveling is for relaxing, so why would you have anything but your favorite comfort foods? There is of course the polar opposite, the adventurous traveler with an appetite for everything new and exotic. Whatever your preference, know that you're not the first. No, the dichotomy between comfort seeker and adventurer goes back to the dawn of modern day tourism. The Grand Tour. So, that's what we're looking at today. When did people start traveling for fun? What did they eat on their travels? And how did they like it? Or hate it? But as usual, let's start at the beginning. What was a Grand Tour? And why do we care? Humans have been traveling in large or small groups for as long as we've been around. This was driven by three main things: work, trade, and religion. Artisans, for instance, traveled far and wide to ply their craft, especially when many of the great cathedrals were built. Trade is, well, pretty self-explanatory. Buy the thing, move the thing, sell the thing. For everyone else, there was religion. Pilgrimages have been around for yonks and were usually the best excuse for people to see the world. Although we're sure many of these travelers enjoyed their journeys, what we today would call going on holiday was still very rare. This would start to change in the 16th century, in the wake of the Renaissance, when a growing fascination with antiquity took over Europe. Sadly, for wannabe travelers of the era, the Renaissance happened roughly around the same time as a little something called the Wars of Religion, which did limit mobility somewhat. However, in the 17th century, after the treaties of Münster were signed, a relative peace descended on Europe, opening the door for travel. Travel went in all directions, but the biggest part of the traffic came from northern, often Protestant Europeans traveling south, enjoying their newfound freedom to move across the continent without too much trouble in an age before visas and passports. Although people traveled from all over the place, we will be focusing on Britain, because we live here. In the 18th century, leisure travel really took off. But in an era before budget airlines, it was still extremely expensive, quite physically taxing, and even dangerous. As such, the average traveller was young, well-off, and often noble. It became a custom for young, affluent people to go on a large tour of Europe before they took over their duties within their families or businesses. This became known as the Grand Tour. In the 20th century, car manufacturers added the suffix Grand Tour, Gran Turismo, or later GT, to cars which they deemed good for long journeys, which is why we hope this video will attract many confused petrolheads. The average British Grand Tourists, and yes, that's where the word tourist comes from, would set off from, well, Britain. From here, they would usually cross the Channel via Calais or Ostend. Ostend in the Spanish Netherlands was more popular when relationships between England and France got a bit too strained. From there, the route could go anywhere, but a popular one was to go via the Ardennes down into present-day Germany, then across the Alps to Rome and Naples. In times when France was more welcoming, the journey could go from Calais down to Lyon and from there to either Nice and then Italy, or Marseille and from there on to Spain. As time progressed, the whole of Europe, from Poland to Portugal, would start receiving British tourists. So, what did they eat? Yes, this is still a food channel. Average British tourists usually ate what was locally available, especially in the early days of grand touring. When in cities, they would have their choice of fresh food, not least because nearby fields could take advantage of the city's night waste. Look it up. However, when out in the countryside, the average tourist would have significantly fewer options, if there were any options to begin with. They therefore often found themselves going hungry between population centres. Returning tourists would warn the next cohort of this, and those who heeded the warning would set off with provisions, mainly bread, cured meats and wine. However, in an age before refrigeration, this often led to annoying situations. One tourist wrote, "I was forced to be content with bad beef and bread. Our butter stunk so intolerably that I don't believe a dog would have eaten it. The last day we were at sea was a day of fasting, and this was only the boat trip between England and the Netherlands. Along the often travelled routes through the Ardennes, for example, inns would start to provide food packages and sometimes even full hampers for travellers. And throughout the 18th century, we can see the food sold going from emergency rations to popular novelties, turning inns into proto-motorway service stations. Very rich tourists would go one step further and travel with a hired cook, often recruited locally, as they would know their way around the available ingredients. Joseph Townsend, no, not that one, advised tourists heading to Spain to pack a tablecloth, knives, forks, spoons, and a copper vessel sufficiently capacious to boil his meat. We've established that the British tourist had to live off what the locals could sell them. So, how did they like it? Well, just like today, there were some who loved it and some who weren't as keen. When encountering continental food, a lot of Brits had some surprising revelations. One English traveller, in 1754, wrote with enthusiasm that in Nice, due to the warmer climate, green peas were available year-round. Another tourist named Swinton ate something special in Italy in 1731. He described it as so tender and fine-tasting that no greens in England or elsewhere can come up to it. The mystery vegetable? Broccoli. Continental food wouldn't have been new to the very affluent, as it was quite trendy to employ French chefs back home, but the slightly less wealthy were in for a bit of a shock. Mind you, this was often a pleasant shock. Another traveller, George Carleton, wrote warmly about Spanish ham while in Madrid, gushing about how flavourful the meat was, because the pigs were fed acorns. Others were astonished about how they could have fresh citrus fruit right off the tree, and new breeds of apricot, not yet available in England. A lot of travellers also found that their meals in the Flemish or French countryside were significantly cheaper than what they were used to in London. In 1773, James Essex had a meal on the boat from Bruges to Ghent, and wrote lyrically about how he enjoyed a dinner served in as neat and elegant a manner as it could be the best London tavern. For only 15 pence per person. Looks like London prices are nothing new. Now let's look at the dish that an 18th century tourist could expect when traversing France. A lovely chicken fricassé. We get this recipe from the ultimate early modern French cookbook, Le Cuisinier François from de la Varenne. You'll remember him if you watched our puff pastry videos. First, butcher a chicken, saving the carcass for another time, since it makes great stock. Clean the bits and cut them to the desired size. Now, poach them for a short time in some chicken stock until the meat is almost cooked. We don't want it to get too soft. Don't worry, if you can still see some pink, we're not done with it yet. Next, we're going to fricassee our chicken, which means frying the meat in some butter until brown. These days, this is usually done with some vegetables, but de la Varenne doesn't mention these. However, feel free to add them if you want. Once nicely browned, flood the chicken in some chicken stock. This can be the stock from when you poached the chicken. Now de la Varenne tells us to add some good herbs, like parsley and Welsh onion. He doesn't tell us to tie these up, but many believe that this is the first recorded use of a bouquet garni, so we're going to do it like this. Season with salt and let simmer for at least half an hour. Feel free to go longer, just make sure it stays largely submerged. The more tender it is, the more your British tourists will like it, won't they? When it's almost time to serve, beat 2 egg yolks in some cream and add some warm stock to temper. This is called a liaison or binder. Turn off the heat and pour over your liaison. Season to taste and serve with some small potatoes. A trendy ingredient at the time. Now, this is a beautiful example of pre-industrial, refined French cuisine, already showing the versatility of sauces and meat. Truly exquisite. And the Brits hated it. The most common grievance by far aired by British tourists that wasn't related to booze or the absence of meat during Lent and on Fridays was the lack of substance to the meat. Unlike the chunky roasts which British tourists were used to back home, French and Italian cuisine to this day prefer to turn meat into ragouts and fricassees. We'll elaborate on the English love for roast and its impact on Europe a bit later in the video, but for now, suffice to say that European meat was simply too tender for British bulldog jaws. In 1784, Anne Scrope wrote, while in Brussels, "We live in the French style. There is nothing brought to the table but what is very tender." In addition, many tourists complained that French and Italian food was overly seasoned and too rich, setting up centuries of clichés to follow. Now, we get people looking for comfort food, but some insisted on bringing the motherland with them. As we said earlier, preservation techniques weren't advanced enough to keep provisions for an entire journey. Well, that didn't stop Evelyn, 2nd Duke of Kingston upon Hull. He hated the food so much that he had Hampshire bacon, Gloucester and Cheshire cheese brought to France, along with a large amount of English beer. He did like other parts of French life though. His tour lasted 10 whole years, and he brought back a mistress along with a ton of gambling debts. Truly a proper English lad. Not every English tourist had the means to have the motherland brought over though. So what were they to do? Well, for them, a solution came about eventually. The local inns and restaurants soon noticed how British tourists were very keen on eating like they would at home, so they learned to cook à l'anglaise. Restaurants along the more popular routes would either advertise that they offered food à la mode anglaise, and sometimes entire inns would be dedicated to serving English grand tourists, like the Hotel York in Nice, all of them serving nice chewy roasts. So, all in all, there was something for everyone. Even the adventurous travellers weren't too sad about the spread of their delicacies across Europe. One tourist wrote in detail about all the Italian specialties they had sampled in Firenze. But even this open-minded tourist was most enthusiastic when one day she found a stall selling British mince pies. With the advent of rail across Europe, the grand tours of the wealthy faded into obscurity. The middle classes started to travel, and the 19th century would see the arrival of the resort. These allowed tourists to travel, but still eat like they were at home at all times. The classic grand tours might have ended, but young, affluent Brits didn't stop traveling. They just went further afield. And one could argue they never stopped. Now, we know this is a very natural ending for the video, and we did think about leaving it here, but there was one more recipe and a story we just had to share. But before we move on, we would like to ask you to either subscribe, like, or leave a comment. Or all of those if you feel like it. Unlike the grand tourists we've shown today, the human doesn't have the money to go on holiday, as these videos are not monetized yet. However, if you click on one or more of these buttons, we might get a bit closer to that, as this video will get recommended to more people. Thank you very much. We've talked loads about rich Brits traveling the continent for their own personal development. But the 18th century also saw a reverse movement. Those who were less wealthy traveling up to Northern Europe. Many of these were artists, like musicians, going on tour. A very famous example is a family from Salzburg who traveled Europe so that their son, a musical prodigy, could perform in front of Europe's high and mighty. The grand tour of the Mozart family. On one of their tours, the father of the family, Leopold Mozart, wrote many letters documenting their travels. He wrote about how everyone in France reeked of perfume, how they were overly powdered, and how the drinking water was apparently straight from the Seine. In England, he was in for quite a shock when it came to the local culinary habits. He describes how people never drank water, but tea in the morning, and after that, only beer. Strong beer. Even the rich and noble. They simply drank cider and wine along with the beer. Although he expresses some worry about the lack of water, he seemed fine with the quality of the booze. He was, however, a lot less impressed when it came to how and what the English ate. For one, he seemed very taken aback by the consumption of lard, both warm and congealed. In addition, he clearly disliked the habit of spreading bacon grease on some toast for supper. And he very specifically and somewhat weirdly to our minds pointed out that the English ate onions. At one point, Leopold was offered something special, a plum pudding, which he described as a delicacy consisting of raisins or even proper apples covered in batter, which are meant to represent a kind of cake. And Leopold found this miserable. He summed up his experience of English food culture with, in a word, they eat like pandours. What the hell are you doing? Not pandas, pandours. Pandours were light infantry militias from the south of the Austrian Empire, known for being hard and grizzled. But when it comes to eating habits, it probably meant rough and unsophisticated. There was one food that he did seem fine with though, and he wasn't the first foreigner to notice how the English excelled at this. The Swedish explorer Per Karl noted in 1748, Englishmen understand almost better than any other people the art of properly roasting a joint, which also is not to be wondered at, because the art of cooking as practiced by most Englishmen does not extend much beyond roast beef and plum pudding. It is hard to overstate the fondness found in England for the roast, especially roast beef. There were even songs about roast beef, like "Oh, the roast beef of Old England," from the opera called The Grub Street Opera, written by Henry Fielding. So, let's make a roast for the Mozarts. Now, the roast described by Leopold was not the Sunday roast we know today. The roast was usually still made on Sunday, so far so familiar, but afterwards everyone just got a small slice. It would then be hung up to dry, and that evening, and for some of the days of the following week, people would get a cold slice from that roast. As you might expect, there is a plethora of roast beef recipes to choose from when digging through old English cookbooks. Hannah Glasse's 1747 seminal work, The Art of Cookery's first section is all about roasts, as you would expect of an English cookbook of the time. Her recipe for roast beef is quite peculiar, as it instructs us to put some paper over top. Friend of the channel, if he were alive, Robert May, writer of The Accomplished Cook, has a number of roast recipes. But he doesn't really elaborate on the technique, apart from just roast it and baste it. He does provide some nice sauces though. However, the one we think is the most interesting, and also, in our opinion, resembles what Leopold Mozart described, is from The Complete English Cook by Catherine Brooks. Like in Hannah Glasse's book, roasts are the first section, right after the table of contents, and beef is the first and foremost among the roasts. We start with a nice joint of beef. Now, every modern cook will immediately feel the urge to coat this in mustard and salt, but don't. Catherine Brooks and Hannah Glasse both tell us not to salt our beef before putting it to the fire, unless it's ribs. So we are preheating our oven to maximum, then putting the meat straight in and reducing it to 170 degrees Celsius. And we don't really get told how long we have to roast it for. Both Brooks and Glasse tell us that the roast is ready when the smoke draws towards the fire. Don't worry, we tested this for you, and the rule of thumb is 1 hour for big roasts, half an hour for small ones. As soon as the meat is in the oven, dissolve some salt in water. Baste your meat with this after 20 minutes in the oven. 10 minutes later, baste with some melted butter. After another 10 minutes, take it out and give it a coating of flour. After that, baste it with its own drippings and put it back. Keep basting it with its own drippings every 5 to 10 minutes until done. We now put our roast aside, and to our pan we're going to add a little bit of stock to deglaze. The Brooks recipe doesn't really tell us this, but it is a technique Robert May uses in an even older cookbook. So we think we have a bit of license here. If you want to, you can make a Yorkshire pudding to go with this, as they are in Hannah Glasse's book. But Leopold didn't mention them, so we're going without. Both Brooks and Glasse give instructions for how to preserve the leftovers, essentially telling us to dry it and then hang it in a place with no moisture. But these days, you can just use your fridge. As for the Sunday portion, Leopold tells us this was served with beans and or potatoes, and that people would pour melted butter over these. Not a bad idea. This dish would have been a sight for sore eyes of many English grand tourists who had finally reached a restaurant that offered food à la mode anglaise, or to the tired father of a young musical genius looking forward to a warm meal. We hope this video was a sight for sore eyes for you too. Thank you very much for watching.